Sometimes the hardest thing in the world is watching your children go to bed hungry and knowing tomorrow won't be any different. For Suddy Mercer, hiding behind the blacksmith's barn in Hollow Trace with her 3 little ones, that nightmare had become her daily reality. The empty biscuit tin in her hands tells a story no mother should have to live. 8 months since her husband died, and the landlord's patience died with him. Now she's got nowhere left to turn and winter coming fast. That's when she hears wagon wheels and boots hitting the ground. Through the barn boards, she sees Gideon Thorneath, richest rancher in 3 counties, and a man who keeps to himself. He looks right at her hiding spot and says 4 words that change everything. Get in my wagon now. Most folks in town know Gideon as hard and unforgiving. But what happens when the most powerful man in Hollow Trace finds the most powerless woman? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Suddy's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at Gideon Thorne through the weathered slats of Murphy's barn. The man stood there like he owned the very air around him, which, truth be told, he practically did. His broad shoulders filled out a worn leather coat that had seen better decades, and his steel gray hair caught what little afternoon light filtered through the October clouds. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. They weren't the cold, calculating as she'd expected from the stories folks told. They held something else entirely, a recognition that made her feel exposed and understood all at once. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, but tempered with something gentler. "Your children are shivering." Tommy pressed closer to her side, his 8-year-old frame trying to shield his baby brother Samuel, while little Lucy buried her face in Suddy's worn skirts. The boy had grown too thin these past months, his shoulder blades sharp beneath his patched shirt. Lucy's once bright red curls hung limp and dull, and baby Samuel, sweet Samuel, who should be toddling and laughing, sat listless in her arms, too weak even to cry properly anymore. Sad's throat closed around the words she wanted to say. What could she tell him? That she'd been a respectable woman once, married to a good man who worked the silver mines until a cave-in took him and 3 others, that she'd tried to make it on her own, taking in washing and mending until her fingers bled, but it wasn't enough to keep up with the rent. That last week she'd sold her wedding ring, her last precious thing, just to buy milk for Samuel. "You know who you are," Gideon continued, stepping closer to the barn. His boots made soft sounds on the packed earth, deliberate and unhurried. "You're Daniel Mercer's widow. He was a good man." The mention of her husband's name nearly undid her. Daniel had been a good man, kind and hard-working, with dreams of building them a proper house once he saved enough from the mines. Ade never lived to see his youngest son take his first steps or hear Lucy recite her letters. Ade never know that his wife would end up hiding behind buildings like some common vagrant. "E me ritorni," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not looking for charity. We're just waiting for something that isn't coming," he finished. His tone held no judgment, just the flat certainty of a man who'd seen enough of the world to know how it worked. "Winter's coming early this year. You can smell it in the air." A was right. The bite in the wind carried the promise of frost, and frost meant the end of any hope she'd harbored of finding work before the deep cold set in. No one hired help when they were battening down for winter themselves. Gideon moved closer still, and she could see the lines around his eyes, not just from squinting into the sun, but from something deeper. Maybe pain that had settled in and made itself at home. The townspeople spoke of him in hushed tones, called him the richest man in 3 counties, but also the loneliest. His wife had died young, they said, along with the child she carried. That was 3 years ago, and he'd been like a ghost ever since, running his vast ranch with ruthless efficiency, but keeping himself apart from the world. "My wagon's comfortable enough," he said, glancing toward the street where a sturdy buckboard waited, pulled by 2 well-fed horses. "And my house has warm rooms and a kitchen that knows how to fill an empty belly." Sad's pride wared with desperation, and desperation was winning. But something in her still resisted. She'd heard the stories about powerful men who helped women in need, stories that didn't end well for the women. "Sir, I can't. We couldn't impose." "You're not imposing." His voice carried a finality that broke no argument. "You're accepting help from a neighbor. That's what decent folks do." Tommy looked up at her with those 2 serious eyes that had seen more hardship than any child should. He didn't speak, hadn't said much since his father died, but she could read the plea in his expression. Lucy had begun to sway on her feet, exhaustion finally overtaking the fear that had kept her upright. And Samuel needed warmth and food and safety more than his mother needed her pride. Why? The word slipped out before she could stop it. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to some point beyond her shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice was rough around the edges. Because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters, and because my house has been too quiet for too long. The honesty in that admission, raw and unguarded, made something shift inside her chest. This wasn't pity. She realized this was recognition. One wounded soul reaching out to another. She looked down at her children, at their thin faces and hollow eyes, and felt her resistance crumble. "Used for tonight," she whispered. "Just for tonight," he agreed, though something in his tone suggested he didn't quite believe it either. The wagon ride through Hollow Track's main street felt like a parade of shame and wonder combined. Faces appeared in windows and doorways as word spread faster than wildfire. Gideon Thorne, the untouchable widower, had taken in the Mercer woman and her children. Sadie kept her eyes fixed on her hands, folded tight in her lap, while the children stared wide-eyed at the world passing by from their perch on actual cushioned seats. Mrs. Henderson from the general store stood on her porch with her mouth hanging open. The banker, Cornelius Blake, stepped out of his establishment with a frown that could have soured milk. But Gideon paid them no mind, his attention focused on the road ahead, as if he was simply running an errand instead of upending the social order of their small town. The Thorne Ranch sprawled across the valley like something from a storybook. Rolling pastures dotted with cattle stretched as far as the eye could see, bounded by split rail fences that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. The house itself was a testament to success stories of solid timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and windows that gleamed like welcoming eyes in the afternoon light. Sadie had never been this close to such grandeur. She'd glimpsed it from a distance when Daniel had worked on some of Gideon's fence repairs, but seeing it up close made her acutely aware of the patches on her dress and the worn soles of her shoes. "Maria," Gideon called as he helped them down from the wagon. A woman emerged from the house, middle-aged and sturdy, with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron. "We have guests. They be staying in the blue room." If Maria was surprised by Edith's announcement, she hid it well. Her gaze took in Sadie and the children with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen her share of need, and her expression softened. "Of course, Señor. Ella prepare something warm for the little ones." The inside of the house was even more impressive than the outside, polished wood floors covered with colorful rugs, furniture that looked both comfortable and expensive, and windows that let in floods of golden light. But it was the warmth that struck Sadie most forcefully. Not just the heat from the massive stone fireplace, but something deeper. Despite its grandeur, this place felt like a home. Gideon led them up a curved staircase to a room that was larger than the entire cabin Sadie had shared with Daniel. A four-poster bed dominated the space, covered with quilts that looked handmade and well-loved. A smaller bed had been placed near the window, perfect for the children, and a cradle sat ready for Samuel. "Maria keeps this room ready," Gideon said, though he didn't explain why. "There's a wash basin behind that screen and she'll bring up hot water shortly." "Super," that says. "Just follow the stairs down and toward the back of the house." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Mrs. Mercer." "Yes, sir." "It's Sadie, isn't it?" When she nodded, he continued, "Sadie, then I'm Gideon. We don't stand much on ceremony here." After he left, Sadie sank into a chair beside the window and let the tears come. They weren't tears of sadness exactly, but something more complex, relief and gratitude, and a bone-deep exhaustion that came from months of carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. Tommy approached cautiously and leaned against her knee. "Mama, are we safe now?" She smoothed his dark hair, Daniel's hair, and tried to find words that wouldn't be a lie. "For tonight, sweetheart, tonight we're safe." But as she looked around the beautiful room with its promise of warmth and comfort, she wondered if one night would be enough to remember what safety felt like. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small treacherous hope began to whisper that maybe, just maybe, Gideon Thorne's house might offer more than shelter from the storm. Down the hall in his own room, Gideon stood at his window, watching the sun set over his land. For the first time in 3 years, his house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt alive again, full of possibility, and the sound of children's voices. He pulled open the top drawer of his desk, and looked down at the small velvet box nestled among his papers. Inside lay his late wife's wedding ringer, simple band of gold that he'd been unable to bury with her. He'd kept it close, a talisman of pain and love and loss. But tonight, for the first time since Catherine's death, he closed the drawer without taking the ring out. Tonight, the future seemed less like an enemy to be endured and more like a gift waiting to be unwrapped. In the kitchen below, Maria hummed an old lullaby as she prepared a meal fit for hungry children. The house that had been silent for so long was beginning to remember how to sing. The first night at the Thorn Ranch, Suddy barely slept. Every creak of the house, every distant sound from the cattle, every whisper of wind through the eaves reminded her that she was somewhere she didn't belong. The bed was too soft, the room too warm, the silence too complete after months of sleeping in places where danger lurked around every corner. She lay listening to her children's peaceful breathing, Tommy's steady rhythm from the smaller bed, Lucy's soft, and Samuel's contented gurgling from the cradle. They had fallen asleep easily for the first time in weeks, bellies full from Maria's hearty stew, and bodies warm beneath clean quilts. The transformation had been immediate, and heartbreaking reminded her of how resilient children could be when given even the smallest taste of security. When dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Suddy rose quietly and began to gather their few belongings. She'd made her decision during the long, sleepless hours. One night of kindness was a gift beyond measure, but she couldn't impose further on Gideon's generosity. They would thank him properly and be on their way before he had cause to regret his impulsive act of mercy. Her hand stilled as she reached for the small bundle that contained Daniel's work boots, the only thing of his she'd managed to keep through all their troubles. The leather was worn smooth from years of hard labor. The laces frayed but still strong. She'd carried them from place to place like a talisman, unable to part with this last tangible piece of her husband. Now in the golden morning light streaming through windows she'd never be able to afford, they seemed like an anchor to a past that no longer existed. A soft knock interrupted her melancholy. "Mrs. Mercer, Sadie." Gideon's voice carried through the door, gentle but concerned. "Maria's got breakfast waiting, and the children are awake." She tucked Daniel's boots back into the bundle and smoothed her hair as best she could. When she opened the door, Gideon stood in the hallway holding Samuel, who was clean and dressed in clothes that actually fit him properly. The sight of the stern rancher cradling her baby with obvious care made something twist painfully in her chest. "It was fussing a bit," Gideon explained, his voice unusually soft. "Maria thought he might be hungry." "Thank you," Suddy managed, reaching for her son. But Samuel seemed content where he was, his tiny hand fisted in Gideon's shirt front, his dark eyes bright and alert in a way they hadn't been for weeks. Downstairs, the kitchen bustled with warmth and activity. Maria had prepared a feast that would have fed them for days in their former life: eggs and bacon, fresh biscuits with honey, milk so rich it left wet mustaches on the children's faces. Tommy and Lucy ate with the focused intensity of children who remembered hunger, while Gideon watched them with an expression that spoke of old pain and new wonder combined. "Slow down, my Joss," Maria said gently, ruffling Lucy's curls. "There's plenty more where that came from." Lucy looked up with eyes wide as saucers. "Really? We can have more?" The simple question hung in the air like a revelation. Sadie felt heat rise in her cheeks, shame wearing with gratitude. They were her children, and they'd been reduced to marveling at the concept of seconds at breakfast. Gideon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "As much as you want, little one, always." After breakfast, while the children explored the ranch yard under Maria's watchful eye, Sadie approached Gideon, where he stood on the porch reviewing ledgers with his foreman, a weathered man named Jack Morrison. "Mr. Thorn Gideon," she corrected herself when he raised an eyebrow. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness last night." The children slept better than they have in months, and the meal was more generous than anything we had a right to expect. Something in her tone must have warned him of what was coming. He set down his papers and gave her his full attention. Those gray eyes reading her face with uncomfortable accuracy. "But," he said simply, "but we can't impose any further. You've done more than enough, and it's time we moved on." Jack Morrison had developed a sudden fascination with his bootlaces. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to where Tommy was helping one of the ranch hands mend a fence, his small hands earnest as he held boards in place. "Where will you go?" Gideon asked finally the question she'd been dreading. There are opportunities in Denver, she said, trying to inject conviction into her voice. More people, more work to be found. Winter work for a woman with 3 young children and no connections. The blunt assessment hit home because it was true. She had no plan beyond getting as far from Hollow Trace as possible before her courage failed, and she found herself accepting more charity than her pride could bear. "I manage," she said, lifting her chin. "I always have." "Have you?" His voice was gentle but relentless. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like managing meant hiding behind barns and watching your children grow thin." The words stung because they were accurate, but they also sparked her temper. "I did my best with what I had. Not everyone can solve problems by throwing money at them." Instead of taking offense, Gideon smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. "That is the fire I was wondering about. Danielle always said you had spirit enough for 2 people." The mention of her husband caught her off guard. "You knew Daniel well." "Well enough. He worked on my fences a few summers back, and he talked about you and the children constantly, proud as a peacock, that man was, especially of his wife's backbone." Sadie felt tears threaten again. Daniel had been proud of her, she'd known that. But hearing it from someone else, someone who had no reason to lie, made the loss feel fresh all over again. "I also worried," Gideon continued, "worried about what would happen to his family if something happened to him. The mines are dangerous work, and Daniel wasn't fool enough to pretend otherwise." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe accepting help isn't about charity or pride. Maybe it's about honoring the wishes of a good man who wanted his family taken care of." Before Sadie could respond, a commotion in the yard drew their attention. Tommy had wandered too close to one of the horse-separated mare that didn't take kindly to sudden movements. The horse reared, hooves flashing dangerously close to the boy's head. Gideon moved faster than seemed possible for a man his size, vaulting the porch rail and reaching Tommy in 3 long strides. He swept the boy out of harm's way just as the mare's hooves crashed down where he'd been standing. "Easy, girl," Gideon murmured to the horse. His voice calm and authoritative. The mare settled immediately, recognizing the voice of her master. "Tommy, you all right?" The boy nodded, shaken, but unheard. "I'm sorry, Mr. Gideon. He just wanted to pet her. No harm done. But Duchess here needs to trust you before she'll let you close. Trust takes time." The words seemed directed at more than just the boy. Gideon's eyes found Sada's across the yard, and she felt the weight of meaning behind them. That evening, after another meal that left the children drowsy with contentment, Sadie found herself alone with Gideon in the parlor. The children were upstairs with Maria, who had somehow produced a collection of toys and picture books that kept them enchanted. "I'd been thinking about what you said," Sadie began carefully. "About Daniel's wishes." Gideon waited, patient as stone. "Eve, and I'm only saying, if we were to stay a bit longer, it would have to be on my terms. You won't be a kept woman or a burden on your household." "What terms?" "I earn my keep. Cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever needs doing, and the children help where they can. Tommy's a good worker, and Lucy's learning her letters. And in return, our men board until spring. When the weather breaks and work opens up again, we'll be on our way." Gideon considered this, his expression, unreadable. "What about schooling for the children?" "He can teach them what they need to know. Tommy needs to be around other boys his age. And Lucy should be learning from someone who finished more than 8 grades. The criticism stung, partly because it was fair. "He did the best I could with the education I had." "I know you did. I'm not criticizing. I'm offering solutions. There's a good school in town and the teacher, Miss Adelaide, is a friend. The children could start after Thanksgiving." The offer was generous, almost suspiciously so. "Why are you doing this? Really?" Gideon was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire that crackled in the massive stone hearth. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. It was trying to hide. 3 years ago, my wife Catherine died giving birth to our son.